In this video, I'd like to present a brief description of how to create a RESTful client for our manufacturer REST service that accesses the manufacturer table in the sample database. This client is going to be a Java Server Faces, specifically a PrimeFaces client, enabling users to use a web interface to access the service. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure our service is running. And then we're going to test our service and verifying that our URI endpoint, when we execute manufacturer entity on the base URL, that it executes the find all, which returns in JSON format an array of manufacturer entities. So now to create the client, the first thing we're going to do is create a new project, and it's going to be a Maven web application. I'm going to call it Manufacturer REST Client. And we can specify anywhere we want it to be put. And the package is going to be org.usd.csci. Manufacturer, oops. Okay, once we have that project created, the next thing we want to do is we want to copy the manufacturer entity class we're used in our service into our client. So I'm going to copy it. I want to rename this I want this package to be called org.usd.csci.manufacturerRESTClient.data. So now we have our entity. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new Java Server Faces from an entity class. And that entity is going to be our manufacturer entity. And the session bean package is going to be .data. The JSF package is going to be .JSF. We want to rename our bundle manufacturer. And we want our customized template to be PrimeFaces. And we want our component to be set to PrimeFaces. And this persistence unit isn't going to matter because we're going to get our data from the service rather than directly from the JPA persistence unit. So you notice that NetBeans created a number of classes for us. So we have our entity facade, and our abstract facade. And these are what we would use if we were going to use this application to directly access the data in the database. But we're not going to use these classes. Instead, we're going to use our RESTful client code to access the RESTful service, and the RESTful service uses the JPA persistence to access the data in the database. So we're going to delete the abstract facade, and we're going to delete the entity facade. Again, we're going to access the data in the manufacturer table in the database through our RESTful service. So now our controller has a variety of errors because it wants to access a facade, this manufacturer entity facade, which we're going to delete because we're not going to use that. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to make a couple of changes to our entity class. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a constructor to this class that will take a string representing a manufacturer entity in JSON format and sets the attributes of this class using that string. So I'm creating a constructor, manufacturer entity, and I'm passing in a string, which is a JSON entity. Now notice that it can't find the symbol JSON object. That's because we need to put the JSON library in our POM file. So we're going to add that dependency. And our group ID is going to be org.json. And artifact ID is going to be JSON. And the version I don't think it matters which version we select in this particular case. So now in my entity class, I can import org.json.json object. So when we see that this requires that we throw a JSON exception, Then I can go ahead and set all my attributes. So we'll get an integer, and we're going to get manufacturer. The most important thing to remember at this point, that these keys have to match the keys specified in this JSON string. So we see the manufacturer ID. So those have to match. So I went ahead and added the rest of the attributes. Notice that for manufacturer, after creating a JSON object, I used getInt because manufacturer ID is an integer. The rest of the attributes within the string, within the JSON string, are string data types, and so I specified getString and then the key of the attribute that I want to get, and I set the attributes in the class. Again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that your keys match the attributes. So we make sure address 1, address 2, city, email, fax, manufacturer ID, name, phone, rep, and state. So all the keys match what comes back in the JSON. One other method I want to create is I want to create a method. We have our toString method, and we might as well go ahead and change that to return the manufacturer ID. Or maybe it would be better to return manufacturer name. Alright, now I want to create a class to JSON that's going to return this manufacturer in JSON format. So I'm going to create a new JSON object, and then I'm going to set its attributes setting all its key values using the attributes in this class. So for example, object dot set or put manufacturer ID and again we need to throw a JSON exception. again, I can't emphasize enough that these keys must match what we expect in our JSON that we get from the server. So for each attribute in the class, I placed the attribute value in the Java JSON object. So once the JSON object is all constructed, I can return object.toString, and this will return so what this method does is it creates a JSON object. It takes each attribute in this class and creates a key value pair in the JSON object, and then it converts that JSON object to a string representing this entity in JSON format. So now we've created a toJSON method, and we've created a constructor that uses a JSON string to set the attributes of this class. So now what we want to do is we want to go to our manufacturer controller. And what we want to do is add the functionality to this controller that will access a RESTful service, so that through a user interface, a user would be able to delete, create, read, and update manufacturer entities in a database. So we already went ahead and deleted any reference to our facade. We still have this. We're not going to use the EJB facade, so we're deleting those references. So what we need to do now is we need to add a web target to our controller, add a client attribute, and add the base URI. So as attributes in this controller, we're going to add our web target, and we see it's the JavaX web target. Then we're going to add a client, and we're going to import that JavaX client. And then we're going to add our base URI. And just to verify that we have it correct, we're going to go to our service, and this is the base URI. So let's start by modifying our find method in our controller. So we want to modify our controller so that it will access this get in our service. So I'm going to find my find method. And here we don't want it to call our facade. We want it to call the RESTful service, and it's going to return. When we call this RESTful service, what we're going to get back from the service is a JSON string representing one manufacturer entity. So we're going to modify this method to call, so when we want to get a manufacturer entity, given the ID of the entity that we want to get, we're going to use our web target. And we have to set the path, so we have to put the ID in the path. So we have resource path, message format, dot format, and this is the format that we're going to accept the ID in, and the object is the ID, and that's the ID of the manufacturer that we're interested in finding. And the get to the service a get request application JSON, and it's a get a string class. What we want this get method to return is a manufacturer entity. What we get from our service is a JSON string. So what we want to return is a new manufacturer and pass in this string, and it'll call the constructor that we added to our entity class that will create this manufacturer entity. So the one thing that we need to remember is this constructor throws a JSON exception. So we want to add a try catch, and we want to catch that exception. And we want to add to our utility unable to find and then we'll return null. So we're going to add the error message to our JSON utility so that it'll be displayed to the user and will return null. So now this is our find. So this code is asking the service instead of calling the The next thing we want to do is we want to modify the find all method. So we find several calls to find all. So instead of asking the facade for find all, we're going to create our own find all. So we know from looking at our service that this is what's returned from our find all. So what we want to do is we want to ask our service for a list of all the entities, and we'll get it in a JSON string, and then we want to convert that JSON string representing an array of manufacturer entities to an array list of manufacturer entities. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a find all method to our controller. And this find all is going to call our service. So we're going to do a get request from our service, and then the JSON string that we get back, we're going to write a method, convert to a list, and we're going to take that Java string and we're going to return an array list of manufacturer entities. So in our method convert to list, pass in that JSON string that represents a list of manufacturer entities. So we're going to create a JSON array using that string. We're going to create a new array list, and then for each entity that's in that array, we're going to get out the JSON string, and we're going to create a manufacturer. So for example, the first one will return this. So the first one is going to give us this string. So we're going to, as a JSON object, so we're going to take that JSON object, convert it to a string. So basically we're sending this string into a manufacturer entity constructor. So it's going to take this string and it's going to get each of the values out of this string and set the attributes for that entity. And it's going to do that for every manufacturer entity in that JSON list. And once we create a manufacturer entity off of that string, we're going to add it to our list. And after we've gone through all of them, we'll return that list. So now we have a list, an array list of all of the manufacturer entities that were retrieved from the database from this find all method. So now we need to worry about editing, creating, and removing entities from the database. So the first thing I want to do is I want to modify this persist method. And we don't have a facade call anymore, so we know we want to delete that. And I want to explicitly call edit, remove, and create. So I'm going to modify this so that if the persistent action is equal to delete, then I'm going to call remove. Else, if the persistent action is equal to update, I'm going to call edit. Otherwise, I'm going to call create entity. And you'll notice that I'm still not able to compile because remove, edit, and create don't exist. So these are the three methods that we're going to have to write. And each of those methods will call our RESTful service to delete, to put, and to post the entity. So let's begin with the remove method. So our remove method takes the ID, and I'm converting the entity ID from an integer to a string, and I can do that by just simply adding empty quotes to it. And then I'm sending that string to our service, and I'm saying I want to delete this record. So it's a delete request using this ID. So it is actually calling this method. Next, let's add our create entity method. So our create entity takes a manufacturer entity, and notice that we're calling a post for create, and we're sending in our entity, and we're getting a response back, and the response we get back is going to be equal to okay. So the response status is going to be okay if everything went well. If it's not, then we're going to throw an exception specifying that the entity wasn't created, and that will be caught here. Now notice that we don't need this EJB exception anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete So if the create doesn't work, it'll throw an exception and we'll specify that there was a persistence error, that it didn't work completely. So we call create entity, the create entity requests a post to our service. If the response that I get back isn't okay, we're going to throw an exception, and that exception will be caught here. Otherwise, we could add a successful message saying that everything was created successfully. Before we actually run our client, we need to do some additions to our default constructor. So we need to initialize our client and our web target. So we're going to say client equals client builder new client, and then our web target equals and we're going to send in our base URI, and then our path again, if we go back and look at our web service, this manufacturer entity is our path. So that's what we were to put in here. So now when we run our client, and we're going to make sure that our entity class implements serializable. So notice that in convert to list, we've got manufacturer ID is not found. And if you look at the key that I use for getting int, it's manufacturer, and what is in the JSON is manufacturer ID. So I had the key wrong, and that's what generated that problem. And now we're able to list the manufacturer entities. So I'm going to delete this record, and it was deleted successfully. Then I'm going to create a new one. And then the new manufacturer is created successfully. And if I wanted to edit this record, that record was edited successfully.